On today's Locked On Giants podcast, we continue our look at the New York Giants 2024 regular season opponents. And on today's show, we have Ross Jackson of Locked On Saints, who's going to tell us everything we need to know about the New Orleans Saints. That's coming your way next on the Locked On Giants podcast.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily New York Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, New York Giant fans, and welcome to another edition of the Locked On Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast family, your team every day. I'm your host, Patricia Traynor, credential member of the New York Giants media for Locked On, as well as for New York Giants on SI. Find my written work over on si.com/NFL/Giants, and a big welcome on in to my everydayers, my Blue Crew community members, my newcomers, and of course, everybody in between. Thank you so much for spending part of your day with us here on the Locked On Giants podcast. And on today's show, we are continuing our look at the New York Giants 2024 opponents. And I'm so happy to have this next guest on here. I love this guy to death. He is Ross Jackson. He is the host of Locked On Saints. Just a super guy. Look at that smile. If you're watching on YouTube,
always.
How can
always
you
present.
not love that smile?
Ever-present smile.
Yep,
Glad to be here with you, Patricia.
Glad to have you here, my friend. And we got a lot to talk about the Saints. You know, we got to get everybody caught up. And, you know, Ross, I think the big storyline, or one of the big storylines for the Saints, is that they have completely just about made over their offense. I mean, they've got a new offensive coordinator, Klint Kubiak. They shook up their staff. I know we got your former running backs coach, Joel Thomas, came over to the Giants,
Right.
but you've got different, position coaches in there. Talk about some of these changes and how this offense is going to change for the Saints.
Yeah, look, it's going to be a massive change for the New Orleans Saints in terms of what they've been running over the course of the past couple of years under Sean Payton, protege Pete Carmichael. That offense was kind of this holdover version of Payton without really ever kind of reaching its, I can't even really say reaching its potential. It never felt like it really had much potential in the first place. And so this is an offense that finally feels like it has potential. The Saints have revamped their entire offensive coaching staff with the exception of a handful of offensive assistants and tight ends coach Clancy Barone, who's a legendary tight end coach in the league, has coached several Hall of Famers. So yeah, I probably want to keep him around. But when it comes down to all the shifts that they've made, they've changed everything from offensive coordinator to through their position coaches, everything, even adding positions like assistant wide receivers coach, all with the intent of bringing the wide zone offense, which is the sweeping offense around the NFL, here to the Bayou. That has been the case, that has been the emphasis here this offseason. So I would expect a lot more of an active offense, a lot more motion, one that tries to run several plays out of the same look, all these other pieces, lots of disguise, and in an attempt to bring offense back down here to the Big Easy.
When you make that kind of a change, the first question, obviously is, do you have the personnel to run it? I mean, you can't fix everything. So that being said, do the Saints have enough personnel to run this type of offense, or are they still maybe a year or two away?
I think they're probably still a year or two away in certain areas. I don't think that they have a long-term solution at tight end at this point. Tight end Juwan Johnson, who's been their starter for the past couple of years, transitioned from wide receiver to tight end just 2 years ago and hasn't really been able to maintain momentum from one season to the other. He tends to finish seasons very strong, but the opening of seasons, he tends to deal with injury. He tends to not really be kind of, or having to do a little bit more like help out in pass protection, all these other things. And so I think that's a space where they're still a year or two away. I think they're possibly a year away still on the offensive line. I think there's still some big questions to answer there. They invested a first-round pick 3 years ago in University of Northern Iowa offensive tackle Trevor Penning, along with wide receiver Chris Olave, who's panned out great. But for Penning, they're now moving him from left tackle to right tackle to see if they can salvage his career. And he's not even through his rookie contract yet. And so it's a little bit concerning there, because is he going to be able to learn a new position? Is starting from square one like that really going to help advance where he already was? We don't know. So I think those are spots where you can still look at this team and say, yeah, They're probably a year or two away, but I think they have the quarterback that they want. I think that they have the wide receiver pieces that they need. They certainly have the running back talent to run a wide zone offense, and they have the athleticism on the offensive line to execute that scheme. But is the offensive line going to be able to hold up on 3rd and long where there is no play action, where there is no run game, where there is none of that stuff? And you just kind of have to block the guy in front of you. I think those are the bigger questions there. But for the most part, I think that the scheme has to be built based on the talent of the team. So the talent of the personnel is kind of irrelevant to whether or not they can run the scheme. The scheme has to be built to match the personnel. If they can do that and find the right marriage, then hopefully they'll be able to, or hopefully for them, they'll be able to put forth greater production on the offensive side of the ball in 2024.
Of course, running the scheme will be Carr. He returns this year. Is this offense a good fit for what he does well?
Yeah, and I think they're going to construct it around what it is that he does well. So the things that the places where he excels, he's a really good play action quarterback. He's a really good operator before the snap. So being able to utilize pieces to diagnose what the defense is doing by utilizing motion, different types of motion, multiple moves of motion before the snap. It allows them to be able to kind of play into Derek Carr's strengths, which is pre-snap diagnosis, reading a defense, and then running the play action game. So I would expect to see a lot of motion, play action, all those things, and then give him a run game, which he rarely had over in his time with the Raiders, didn't have with the Saints last year. So if the run game gets going, I think that helps your quarterback out a ton as well.
Based on what you've seen of this offense, and from the outside looking in, it just seems like there's a lot of feel good about this offense and the direction and getting this Saints team back on track. So that being said, I mean, do you think this is sustainable, or do you have any concerns whatsoever, outside of, what you've already mentioned about just the whole system as a whole, and how they maybe match up against, teams like the Giants and the other opponents they're going to face?
Yeah, I think, look, introducing a wide zone system and trying to utilize that, what's sweeping the NFL, as we mentioned earlier, I think is a good call. It makes you a matchup similar to every other offense or most of the other offenses in the NFL. But I don't think that it necessarily makes you unique just having implemented this offense that is already the trendy offense around the league. So I think you have to find ways to be unique. Maybe that's where an offensive weapon, Swiss Army knife like Taysom Hill comes in, his ability to be able to change the tempo, everything that you can do with him. Maybe he's the guy that makes it a little bit more unique and allows them to match up in ways that are a little bit more specific than most defenses are accustomed to matching up to this system. But outside of that, it's not like the NFL defenses that they face, it's not like the Giants, for instance, will see anything from the New Orleans Saints that they haven't seen before. Teams within the NFC East run this similar system. Everybody just kind of puts their own thumbprint on it. So we'll have to see what the thumbprint is. I think my major concern with this offense, Patricia, is the offensive line. We just don't know. I mean, we just don't know if it's going to work. They invested a first-round selection in Oregon State offensive tackle, Taliesin Fuanga, who's been fantastic for them, but then they moved him from right tackle to left tackle. Will he pan out there in the pros? They don't really have a solution yet at left guard, although it looks like they have a leader in the clubhouse. And then again, right tackle, we're still not sure if Trevor Penny's going to pan out. So you've got 2 of your 5 offensive linemen that are sure things, and the rest are big-time question marks. And I think that is a huge question mark to have about whether or not this offense will work, because if the offensive line could succeed, then great. But if it can't, this offense will never get off the ground.
Do you feel that this is kind of a last-ditch attempt by Dennis Allen to kind of salvage things, keep the program on track, or get the program back on track?
I think that there's a concerted effort of getting the program back on track and trying to win with the players that they have in the building. I'm not sure that his seat is very hot. I don't know that it's necessarily that he's, I won't say that it's a last ditch effort for him to keep his job, because I don't think that that's the case. But I think the way you phrased it is perfect. I think it's their last ditch effort of trying to maintain what they have. I think if this doesn't work, then you start having to really look at, what do you do at the quarterback spot if that's where you come up short again this year? What do you do at running back with an aging running back like Alvin Kamara? What do you do on the defensive side, where at all 3 levels, your most important player is above the age of 33 or 32? I think you have to be ready to kind of kind of make those types of decisions, ask those types of questions if this offense in 2024, if this team in 2024 isn't as much as a playoff team. I don't even think it's about a winning record. I think it's, do you get into the playoffs or not? And I think that's got to be the measuring stick for what is or isn't a successful season for them this year.
All right, Giant fans, you are listening to the Locked On Giants podcast with me, Patricia Traina, and special guest Ross Jackson of Locked On Saints. Coming up, we're going to ask about Alvin Kamara because that's been a big storyline for the Saints. So Ross will hopefully be able to give us a little bit of the scoopage as to what's going on there. Don't go anywhere. Hey, Giant fans, passion, drive, and patience. What brings home the winning trophy is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more, whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. So go on and keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply, eBay's Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. All right, Giant fans, welcome back to the Locked On Giants podcast. I'm your host, Patricia Traina, with the incredibly handsome and talented Ross Jackson, host of Locked On Saints. We are continuing our special look at all of the New York Giants regular season opponents. Off season's over. We're getting ready for the regular season here. Yay! Yay! Finally, right? So we are going to feature our Locked On hosts. They're going to come on. They're going to tell us about the changes made to their team, the personnel, what's going on, what are the key storylines, and then we'll of course look at some very preliminary matchups, which once we get into the regular season and we do our crossovers, then we'll really do a deep dive into all that stuff. So make sure you keep it here all week long on the Locked On Giants podcast. And don't forget to check out Locked On Saints because Ross does one heck of a job. And Ross, I got to ask you, what is going on with Alvin Kamara? You mentioned him. I know he wants a new contract. I think he took off a couple of times or something like that. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so Alvin Kamara, New Orleans Saints starting running back, and the team have been kind of in this contract negotiation space for about 2 months, a couple of months, let's just say. And as a part of that, here this past week, the Saints held their 3-day mini camp. He participated in 2 of the 3 days. On the third day, he participated in walkthroughs, but then he left. And a lot of people will maybe have you believe that he stormed off and that, he walked out on everybody and it caused a ruckus and everything like that. It wasn't that. Like, we saw him in the parking lot in between walkthrough and the beginning of practice. He was fine. It's not that type of a situation, but he did not participate in the third day of minicamp practices. So, and so really narrative wise, it's up to you which one you choose. Either he was in the midst of a contract dispute and skipped a day of minicamp, or he was in the midst of a contract dispute and participated in 2 of 3 days of minicamp. You can look at it whichever way you want, and that will probably color how you feel about it. But I think the biggest thing here is that it's not a question of how much he's being paid. It's a question of what's the commitment. Patricia, he has a $10.2 million base salary this year. $1 million of that is guaranteed. Next year, he has a contract with a base salary of over $22 million. $0 of it is guaranteed. He's averaging $500,000 of guaranteed money over the course of the next 2 seasons. No running back nearing the age of 30 is going to play on that contract. This is not an unreasonable ask by Alvin Kamara and his camp. I would expect probably them to maybe find some kind of happy medium in some type of a 2-year extension that just guarantees some of the money in 2025 and probably also knocks his base salary down. And for a team that's already $85 million over the salary cap for 2025, I think they'd welcome that. So I think that's really what we're going to end up seeing here. There's a chance that this drags into training camp, but I think that by the time that we get to the regular season, of course, and especially with the new CBA and $50,000, however much it is now, of a fine per day you miss, I believe it's $50K. you're probably going to see this get resolved at some point during training camp, possibly before. But with them doing training camp out in California, not here in New Orleans, the next time that they'll all be together won't be until they're in California. So I would expect this to maybe drag in the training camp a bit. But I think by the time that the Giants and Saints are meeting one another, barring injury, Alvin Kamara is on the field, and Alvin Kamara is a part of the team in 2024.
Sticking with the offense here, Ross, you mentioned that there's some question marks about the depth at certain positions. I think you have Chris Olave, who is, like you said, I think probably your number one guy. But what about the rest of the skill positions? I mean, how do you feel about them? Do they have enough, do you think, to be competitive?
Yeah, it's interesting. The wide receiver position in particular lacks the marquee name, but doesn't lack the marquee level talent. Chris Olave is going into his third season, 2 straight 1,000-yard seasons, only 9 touchdowns to his name so far over the course of those 2 years. But the difference here going into 2024 is that there's no question that he's the bona fide number one. There's no more Michael Thomas on the roster 2 years ago. Veteran wide receiver Jarvis Landry was also on the roster. So Olave was kind of the third guy his first season. This year, there's no question about it. He is the guy. He is the wide receiver. And so I think that will lead to a much more productive 2024 for him, and will probably help to elevate his status a bit when it comes to the NFL. Maybe get him a little bit closer to the conversations that some are having with your New York partners over with the Jets and Garrett Wilson, for instance. And so what happens behind him is very interesting because, again, they don't have the marquee name, but they have a great talent in Rashid Shaheed, who is an incredible field stretcher, an undrafted free agent guy that entered the league and out of Weber State. He was an all-pro and pro bowler as a special teamer, returner last season. And he also put up over 700 receiving yards and was a big-time downfield threat for this team. I think his role continues to grow. He needs to become a little bit more of a 2-level threat than a 1-level threat, but I think that they'll give him those opportunities. And I'm excited to see how Klint Kubiak, knowing that he has now had experience in a Kyle Shanahan offense and the way that guys like Brandon Ayuk and Deebo Samuel have been used, what are some of the creative things that you can do with one of the faster players in the league? And then behind that, you have a lot of guys that, as long as they fit their specific role, they'll have ways to contribute. Second-year wide receiver A.T. Perry is your quintessential X-receiver, lone guy over on the outside that can be your split end. And then they also signed veteran wide receiver Cedric Wilson Jr., who started his time with Dallas. I'm sure that you've had some overlap in terms of him. He had a great season there in 2021 as a slot receiver. He'll be a big slot option for the New Orleans Saints, kind of like what Juwan Jennings was for the San Francisco 49ers last year, probably throwing less touchdowns and fewer Super Bowls, if we're being honest, though. And so I think that they have the talent. They certainly just don't have the marquee names, but I think that they have what they need in order to be able to operate this offensive system at that position.
I want to go back to the offensive line because you mentioned there's some question marks there. It seems like everybody has question marks on the offensive line, including the Giants. But
that's today's
going
NFL.
Against the Giants, one of their strengths, at least the way it's shaping up now, is the front seven. Dexter Lawrence is a load to handle. I mean, we still don't know who the 3 technique is going to be. They've got Brian Burns to pair up now with Kayvon Thibodeau. They've got Bobby Okereke in the middle. I mean, that is a pretty, upgraded front seven.
Really good. Really good.
So that being said, and I know, the two teams won't see each other until later in the year, but where are you most concerned, potentially facing that lineup? Where do you think is a spot right now that maybe Giants, not just the Giants, but other teams can have success exploiting?
Yeah, it's got to be in the trenches. It's got to be in the trenches, especially with experienced players like the players that you just described that could be coming off the edge. I mean, Thibodeau, and then you look at a guy like Brian Burns, who was without a doubt the best player in the NFC South division until he was traded to the New York Giants. And so the New Orleans Saints went from, oh, great, don't have to worry about him anymore, to, well, actually, it looks like he shows up on the schedule in 2024 after all. And so I think that's my biggest concern heading into this game for the New Orleans Saints going up against the Giants is going to be how can they hold off that pass rush? How can they I don't want to use the phrase neutralize, but I'll use it just in a broader sense. But how can they find a way to neutralize this defensive line as a whole, right? It's not just about the pass rush. It's can you get your run game going against a very stout group of run stoppers as well as pass rushers. There's a lot of question marks that come from all of that. So I think that's probably the biggest thing that I look at for New Orleans, and especially coming off of last year where the New Orleans Saints defense put so much of a hurt on the Tommy DeVito legacy and the New York Giants. Like the Giants are going to be looking at the New Orleans Saints and going, oh, as hurt and as weak as the offensive line was for the Giants last year in 2023, that's what the New Orleans Saints could be looking like in 2024. And I think that the New York Giants defensive line will be ready for that challenge and to make their side of the statement.
Speaking of defense, we're actually going to cover the Saints defense because this is a little bit more of a stabilized unit, a unit that has been together, the same system at any rate for the last several years. So we're going to talk about that and their role, not just in, doing their thing, but maybe carrying this team. So that's coming up next, right after this. All right, everybody, welcome back to the Locked On Giants podcast. You got me, Patricia Traynor, your host, with Ross Jackson of Locked On Saints. And
Hello.
We are previewing, hello. He's so friendly. You got to love him. You got to love that Southern hospitality. We are previewing the New Orleans Saints, who are on the New York Giants schedule this year. And I'm so happy because anytime I get a chance to work with Ross, I'm just happy. I just love it.
And I'll get to see you.
I'll
get to see you this time too, in person, in the flesh.
Yes, definitely. So that should be fun as well. So anyway, we are talking New Orleans Saints with Ross Jackson of Locked On Saints. And Ross, let's talk about the defense. This defensive system, I think, is going on its 8th season under the same coordinator, the same philosophy. Obviously, some faces have changed, but from a big picture, do you feel that this defense feels that it has to kind of carry this team, especially given all the changes on offense?
I think there's an element of that for sure. I mean, you think about the leaders of this defense, Cameron Jordan down on the defensive line, their star defensive end that they drafted back in 2011, Demario Davis in the second level, one of the better linebackers, off-ball linebackers, in the NFL, joined the team back in 2018. And then just a few years ago, the addition of Tyrann Mathieu at safety, bringing him back home to New Orleans was a huge, huge deal. But all three of those guys definitely look at this as an opportunity for them to step up and say, okay, this team is a defensive team. And I think that they're ready. I think they would be ready to take on the responsibility of kind of shouldering the brunt of the responsibility while the offense gets into rhythm. It's going to be such a big question. How many games does it take for the Saints offense to find their rhythm? It took them 12 weeks last year. And that was on a system that was way less complex than this system is at least proving to be, although the play calls are a lot less complex. So maybe that helps out a little bit. But I think so. I think you're absolutely right. I think this defense looks at this as an opportunity now to be able to say, okay, this is our team. Y'all figure your stuff out over the offensive side. We'll do our role in keeping you in the game in the meanwhile.
I look at that Saints defense and I look at the Giants offensive line because it all starts with the Giants offensive line. And while I am optimistic the line will be better than it was last year, because look, you just don't get any worse than that line was last year, I'm still a little concerned about that Saints defensive front. Can you just talk about how that unit has matured? Any new tweaks maybe that they'll be incorporating that you think we might see?
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the biggest things is going to be Carl Granderson. He's actually the guy that lines up opposite Cam Jordan on this defensive line. He will be the defensive end in 2024 for the New Orleans Saints that receives the most snaps and will probably be their sack leader for a second year in a row. He had 8.5 sacks last year. Not a very productive defensive line in terms of sacks last season, but Carl Granderson was kind of one of those jewels that did stand out amongst the pressure. One of the things that the Saints have also done is that they added Chase Young, formerly, of course, of Washington, spent a portion of last season all the way up to a Super Bowl opportunity with the San Francisco 49ers. He had a neck procedure this offseason, but it seems that everything's good. He actually sounds like he's going to be cleared to play in training camp or to take part in training camp, which I think is a little bit ahead of the curveball or the 8-ball in terms of what it was that they were expecting, which is that he would be ready for the season. So I think that between Carl Granderson's maturity as a this unique blend of speed, power, bend, agility, all these other pieces that he maybe adds. And Chase Young, who is a quintessential speed rusher, which is a part of the formula that the New Orleans Saints have typically avoided in the past. They like the speed to power conversion, 6'6", 6'5" type edge rushers. Chase Young's a little bit of a different prototype for them. And so, and I think that is a good thing. It's a good change for this pass rush. So I'm looking forward to seeing how the three of those guys operate together. Cam, Carl, Chase, gonna be a lot of fun. But I think that there are additions on the interior as well. You get into the second year of Brian Brzee, last year's first round pick, who had a really nice rookie season. You have the continuing veteran presence of Colin Saunders as well as Nathan Shepard on the interior. And then they drafted out of University of Northern Iowa this past year in the 6th round, Christian Boyd, who's kind of this big run plugger who has been really, really disruptive over the course of rookie minicamp, OTAs, and minicamp. We'll see what happens when they get to training camp and preseason. But I think that this defensive line has the ability to take some steps forward, particularly in the run game where they were pretty lackluster last year in terms of run defense. But for me, the big question is going to be, can they finish when they get to the quarterback? That's been the biggest issue. They can get to the quarterback, but getting the quarterback down to the ground has been a big issue for this New Orleans Saints defensive line. Let's see if they can improve upon that in 2024.
One of the matchups I know I'm kind of looking forward to is the Saints defensive secondary versus the Giants receivers. Especially now the Giants have Malik Neighbors, who, although he hasn't started yet, he hasn't played it down. There's a lot of hope, a lot of optimism. He's going to be the number one receiver, a guy who opens things up for the rest of the Giants receivers. Talk about that matchup, if you will, what the Saints have and maybe how they look to slow down the Giants receivers.
Yeah, I will say real quick that the positivity and the optimism around Malik Neighbors is entirely warranted. I mean, being here in Louisiana, I had the opportunity to see him play in person several times. And just when's the last time that a early LSU wide receiver hasn't panned out? And I think the New York Giants fans will remember one that certainly panned out for quite a while until that, changed at a later time. But yeah, I think that the biggest thing is going to be the Saints. Like, they won't change their defensive game plan based upon who they're going up against. They might shift a little bit of stuff. They might adjust based upon like what that team, how that offense operates in terms of landmarks or areas of the field that they want to attack in the passing game and things like that. So they might get a little bit more ready for that. Might get a little bit more ready for teams like the New York Giants, who have a quarterback that can extend plays and be pesky with the ball in his hands and things like that. But outside of that, like, the New Orleans Saints defensive DNA has been the same DNA since 2017. Not much has changed. They want to get up on the line of scrimmage. They want to get in your face. They want to get hands on the wide receivers off the line of scrimmage, and they want to just bully people. And they have no issue putting their corners on an island and saying, you go out there and do it, while safeties act as more of a last line of defense as opposed to a double coverage over the top or a bracket coverage over the top. So I think that it's all going to come down to physicality. And that's typically what's going to be utilized against a rookie wide receiver like Malik Neighbors in his early NFL days anyway. It's how ready are you for NFL level strength, NFL level speed, NFL level physicality. They're going to want to test that. Every team is going to want to test Malik Neighbors in that way. And I don't think the New Orleans Saints will be an exception. Their strength on this team is absolutely their secondary between Marshawn Lattimore and Paulson Adebo out at corners. We'll see who's in the slot, whether it's newly drafted Kool-Aid McKinstry or more likely a second year in that area for Alontae Taylor, and then two talented safeties led, of course, by Tyrann Mathieu, as we mentioned earlier. It's strength on strength when it comes to the Giants wide receivers up against the Saints defensive backs. And I can't wait. It's one of the things I'm most excited to watch this season.
Yeah, for sure. Ross, final question for you. I know it's early. The final roster hasn't been set, but if you had to kind of define the identity that this version of the Saints team is taking on, what would it be?
Disguise. It's all about disguise. And that's on both sides of the football. The New Orleans Saints defense will be operating in such a way that it will be trying to look the exact same depending upon field situations, right? Their 3rd and 10, 3rd and 6 looks will be almost exactly the same, but their first and 10, second and 10 looks are going to be different than the third and 10 ones, but will automatically look the same as each other. So as you repeat game situations and field down and distance, all those things are taken into account. Everything's going to look the same. And the Saints offense will be the same way. They want to take a little bit of a page out of Sean McVay's playbook over with the Los Angeles Rams and not only incorporate the Shanahan route tree, the Shanahan, motion, the Kubiak motion, all these other things that they do, going back to Gary Kubiak, but they also want to run everything out of a similar look. They want everything to look the same. And so I think you're going to see that on both sides of the football. Their identity will be disguising and attacking based on that disguise and trying to trick the unit that's across from them. So if I had to boil it down to one word, it's disguise. I think that's what this team is going for in 2024.
Okay. I mean, it's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out. Mm-hmm. What we expect now isn't necessarily what we're going to get when the two teams meet later on in the season. But by then, the good news is the Saints should be settled maybe in their offensive scheme. The Giants hopefully will be purring along, fingers crossed. I don't know if I can go through another year like last year. But as always, it's great to have the two teams come up against each other, and it's especially looking forward to seeing you. That's what I'm most excited about.
That's my highlight. It could be a 6 touchdown versus 7 touchdown quarterback game. And the only thing I'm going to care about is I got the CP train. So I'm good.
Absolutely. Ross, listen, I appreciate you coming on. It is Ross Jackson, host of Locked On Saints. Check out his work, and not just his work, but check out all of our hosts. Whether you're into the MLB, NHL, NBA, whatever your college, we've got a host. And I'll tell you, our folks really do a good job. They are truly experts, and you just won't find a better group of people, not just experts, but just good people anywhere else. So anyway, for Ross Jackson, I'm Patricia Trainer, Giant fans, that's going to do it for this edition of the Locked On Giants podcast. Thank you, as always, for spending time with us. Have a great weekend, everybody. We'll see you next week with all new episodes of the Locked On Giants podcast.